One November evening in 2016, a violent thunderstorm swept through the city, turning the sky into a dark curtain of hail. In the midst of the chaos, the professor sat alone in his backyard, motionless under the pouring rain. The wailing sirens mingled with the sound of the raindrops, creating a cacophony of disaster. The city was in a state of total panic, but the professor showed no surprise. Just a day earlier, he had predicted exactly what was happening. He tried to warn people, but his words fell on deaf ears and suspicion. Now, everything was happening exactly as he feared. Lives were taken, the city was destroyed. The professor sat there, not in resentment, but as a helpless witness, seeing the consequences of negligence. But before we explore this story further, let's take a moment to reflect. If you love strange, dark, and mysterious stories told in an engaging way, then you've come to the right place. Don't forget to like, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new videos. Now let's get started with today's story, where things aren't always what they seem. A stormy story. At 5:30 p.m. on November 21, 2016, a stormy evening in Melbourne, Australia, Jodie Santoro, a young mother of 21 years, woke up to the shrill cries of her 4-month-old son. The baby's cries echoed through the small house, mixed with the violent sound of hail and strong winds pounding the roof. The windows shook, rattling as if they were about to burst. Jodie looked out the bedroom window. The scene outside blurred in the thick rain. Lightning flashed across the dark sky, accompanied by the distant rumble of thunder. She reached for her phone on the nightstand and checked the time. When the screen lit up, it read 5:30, and she suddenly realized she had overslept. The heat of the day had drained her, and caring for a 4-month-old boy had left her exhausted. The baby's cries grew louder, urgent, and frantic. Jodie, tired as she was, knew she couldn't put off caring for her son. She tried to swing herself out of bed, but as soon as she stood, a strange sensation swept over her. She was so dizzy that she had to hold on to the bed frame to keep her balance. At the same time, her chest tightened, a choking sensation that terrified her. She knew exactly what was happening. This was the beginning of an asthma attack. Jodie had lived with the condition for years and was familiar with the early symptoms. She quickly reached for the inhaler on the nightstand, brought it to her lips, pressed the button, and took a deep breath. But strangely, instead of feeling relieved, her lungs were still constricted, unable to get any air in. Panicking, Jodie tried again, pressing harder and taking a deep breath. But again, it didn't work. At this moment, everything around her seemed to become more suffocating than ever. The baby's cries, the sound of rain hitting the windows, and the wind whistling through the cracks in the door made her mind confused. Remembering the nebulizer, a device more powerful than an inhaler, which could deliver medication more quickly and effectively, Jodie decided to use it. But the problem was that the machine was in the closet and needed to be assembled before use. Her hands were shaking, her mind was spinning, making it impossible for her to do it herself. Just then, her fiancé walked into the room, his face showing concern as he heard his son's cries. But when he saw Jodie, he immediately realized she was in an emergency. Jodie whispered weakly, "I can't breathe." Without waiting to hear more, he rushed to the closet, took out the nebulizer, and assembled it in a flash. Once it was ready, he placed the mask on her face, turned it on, and told her to take deep breaths. But strangely, like the inhaler before, the nebulizer didn't seem to work. Jodie felt each breath becoming labored, her lungs tightening. She turned to her fiancé, her voice weak and almost inaudible. "Call an ambulance." Outside, the storm was more violent than ever. Hail pounded the roof, and the wind howled outside. Inside, the tension was at its peak, as Jody's fiancé called the ambulance service, trying to explain her dire situation over the sound of rain and wind. The minutes waiting for the ambulance to arrive seemed endless. Jody lay in bed, her breaths becoming more shallow. She felt herself slipping away. Just as she was about to collapse, paramedics rushed into the house. They quickly lifted her onto a stretcher and took her to the ambulance. In her unconsciousness, Jody only managed to whisper, "I'm dying," before her world went dark. Sunshine Hospital and the asthma storm, a night of terror. On a gloomy afternoon, the sun fading behind the dark clouds gathering on the horizon, Jody Santoro felt her chest heavier than ever. Sudden bouts of shortness of breath forced her to call an ambulance immediately. The ambulance from Sunshine Hospital rushed in with sirens blaring, shattering the silence of the neighborhood. Medical staff quickly tried to stabilize Jody's condition while the ambulance sped down the road. One held the oxygen bag tightly, continuously forcing oxygen into her lungs. Another monitored her vital signs on a small screen. Behind her, her fiancé drove in a state of extreme anxiety, his eyes never leaving the signal lights of the ambulance ahead. He kept praying, hoping that Jody would overcome the crisis. When the ambulance arrived at the Sunshine Hospital gate, the medical staff quickly pushed Jody's stretcher into the emergency room. Screams and calls for help echoed everywhere as doctors and nurses fought for every precious second to save her life. Jody's fiancé stood helplessly outside, watching as doctors surrounded her, inserting an endotracheal tube to pump more oxygen into her lungs. Fortunately, the tireless efforts of the medical team temporarily stabilized Jody. But before she could breathe a sigh of relief, she was transferred out of the emergency room to make room for new patients. The hospital corridors were filled with patients, all with the same symptoms of severe breathing difficulties. The situation at Sunshine Hospital became chaotic as the number of patients increased. Ambulances lined up around the hospital area. Doctors and nurses ran from the waiting room to the hallway, from the hospital yard to the emergency room, trying to handle each case in the scarce conditions. Meanwhile, Jody was being moved to the ICU. Her fiancé sat beside her, holding her hand tightly, listening quietly to the steady beeping of the monitor. He looked out the window where medical staff were still running around, their faces tense and worried. Elsewhere, far from the hospital, Professor Philip Taylor sat in his home office, staring nervously at his computer screen. An expert on airborne allergens, he had spent years studying the effects of weather on human health. The day before, he had noticed an unusual weather pattern with all the right conditions for a rare and dangerous event, an asthma storm. An asthma storm is an extremely rare phenomenon that only occurs when three special conditions converge: high temperatures, a strong thunderstorm, and extremely high concentrations of grass pollen. On November 21, 2016, Melbourne, Australia, had all three of these elements. When the storm hit, strong winds and heavy rains broke grass pollen into tiny fragments, small enough to bypass the body's natural defenses and penetrate deep into the human lungs. Thousands of otherwise healthy people suddenly had difficulty breathing, and hospitals across Melbourne were flooded with patients with the same symptoms. Jody was among the more than 10,000 people hospitalized that night. Although she survived, she will never forget the feeling of despair when she couldn't breathe, nor the chaotic scene at the hospital. Of those affected, 10 died, including people who had never had asthma. In the days that followed, Jody gradually recovered, but the terrifying memories of that fateful night haunted her. She realized how fragile life is and how things can change in the blink of an eye. Professor Taylor is a renowned meteorologist who has devoted his entire career to studying extreme weather events. For him, tracking hurricanes, tornadoes, and other unusual weather phenomena is a passion and a responsibility. However, no amount of research could have prepared him for the extraordinary event that occurred that year, a rare weather phenomenon that he had never witnessed in his life. The storm that year was not just an ordinary storm. It brought with it the strangeness of what scientists call localized cold storm, a phenomenon that has rarely been recorded. Survivors reported that the air seemed to freeze, creating a suffocating feeling, and the winds carried a coldness so cold that it paralyzed any living thing within its range. When the phenomenon appeared on the radar, Professor Taylor immediately realized that this was a rare opportunity to study an extremely rare climate phenomenon, but he also did not expect that it would become a terrifying reminder of human powerlessness in the face of the unpredictable power of nature. On the other side of the story, Jody, a resident of the area directly affected by this phenomenon, never thought that the air she and her family breathed every day could become the biggest threat to them. When the storm suddenly swept through the town, everything seemed to change in an instant. That morning started like any other normal day. Jody took her children to school, stopped by the grocery store to buy groceries, and planned to tend to her small garden in the afternoon. But then, the first signs appeared. The air became stuffy. A cold feeling ran down her spine, and thick gray clouds covered the sky. Jody and her family took refuge in their home, but they quickly realized that even the safest place could not keep out the danger. Outside air seemed to seep in through every crack in the door, carrying a suffocating coldness. Her young child began coughing violently, and everyone in the family found it difficult to breathe. When the storm passed, Jody and the other survivors realized that they had faced an unprecedented threat. Air, the most ordinary and necessary thing, had become their greatest enemy. She saw the terrible damage all around her, destroyed houses, fallen trees, and most of all, the bewilderment on the faces of those lucky enough to survive. For Professor Taylor, the event was not only a challenge in her career, but also a reminder that nature always has unexpected ways of asserting its power. Despite decades of research, he realized that there was still much that humans did not fully understand. He decided to use the event as an opportunity to raise public awareness about rare weather phenomena, while emphasizing the importance of disaster preparedness. Jody, on the other hand, realized that life can change in an instant and that nothing can be taken for granted. Air, water, or even the most ordinary elements can become dangerous when nature is angry. She decided to participate in disaster response training programs, learning how to better prepare to protect her family in the future. The story of Professor Taylor and Jody is not only a reminder of the power of nature, but also a lesson in human fragility in the face of phenomena beyond our control. It affirms that, no matter how advanced we are, we still need to maintain a deep respect for nature and always be ready to adapt. In every storm, whether it's a storm in real life or a storm in the soul, the biggest lesson is always appreciate the simple things and be prepared to face whatever may happen.